One APIA Nevada is a grassroots nonprofit organization that advocates for policies empowering everyday Asian Pacific Islander Nevadans. Nevada is home to a growing APIA community, accounting for 1 in 10 voters. We are One APIA Nevada. Concili Incorporated is Nevada's premier Democratic campaign firm. Fighting for progressive issues and candidates for over a decade, and proud sponsor of Battleborn Progress.
With Annette. My name is Annette Magnus, and I'm the Executive Director of Battleborn Progress. Thank you so much for joining us tonight on another episode of Out in Front. I am so excited about this episode. I am calling this Liz Becker's episode because she came up with it. She emailed me her idea. So if you ever have ideas about topics that we should be talking about on Out in Front, email me. Let us know. We want to hear from all of you, our viewers. Because there's so many different topics we want to hit on, and this is a good one. So tonight we are talking about the truth about gas prices. How do gas prices work? How are they set? Who sets them? And where do they all come from? Where does this all start? And then what do we do about transitioning away from relying on foreign oil? How do we go and decarbonize? How do we go and do that in an equitable and sustainable way? So I've got 3 amazing people here tonight joining me who are going to talk all about this issue and more. So tonight, of course, we have former environmental science professor Elizabeth Becker, again, who created this show with me. I'm super excited to have you, Liz. We have Professor and Chair of the UNR Department of Economics, Elliot Parker, and our very own Maria Teresa Lieberman Parga, who's joining us to talk all about our decarb report we did with so many of our community partners. So first, we're going to start with Professor Parker. Professor, thank you so much for joining us. Come on in, introduce yourself, and you're going to do a little presentation for us tonight to learn about this topic. So thank you for joining us.
Yes, hi, Annette and Liz. Thank you for inviting me onto your show. I just had a few comments, and I've got graphs and other things if you want to see them. I've tried to study this a little bit because it's a topic many people are interested in. Let me also say I'm sorry I'm not wearing my normal tie or bow tie, but I was in DC last week. I haven't had time to go to the dry cleaners to pick up my shirts. So
we're not that formal here, so you're welcome in anything you wear.
Well, to start with, Americans do care about their wallets. And certainly with an election coming up, that's something that affects what they think about. But Americans also care about freedom and democracy. They know it is wrong to support dictators who invade other countries, particularly when those other countries have governments that actually have the consent of the governed. But the cost of excluding Russia from the world market are still very real for many people, and we should not dismiss them just because they're small on average. Long term, as I assume Liz would agree, we have to dramatically reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. And that means, among other things, moving away from fossil fuels. But in the short term, this can be very painful for many people. It is important to understand also that this is a global market. It's much less concentrated than it used to be. The United States is the world's largest producer of oil, but we only produce about 20% of the world's oil. Even OPEC doesn't have the price setting power that it used to have. Now, how much does this affect people? On average, Americans spend about 4% of their income on energy. That includes gasoline for their cars. The average American driver drives around 1,200 miles a month in a car that gets an average of 25 miles per gallon. Gasoline jumped up since the end of December, and this is primarily driven by what's going on with Russia and Ukraine. It's jumped up by about $1.20 per gallon since then. And that means that on average, the average driver is paying about $55 more a month as a result of the disruption in the global oil markets due to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. It works out to about an extra 1% of our total income before taxes. But averages can disguise a lot. In the West, we already pay a lot more for gas, especially Nevada. We're one of the highest price states after California, and we're right there tied with Hawaii. We drive more, we have less reliable public transportation in the West. In rural Nevada, folks tend to drive vehicles that don't get anywhere near 25 miles per gallon, and they drive a lot more. People with lower incomes are much more likely to live further away from their jobs, and that extra $1.20 a gallon is a bigger hit on their lower incomes. Diesel prices are even higher, so truckers are going to see a big hit, or already seeing a big hit to their fuel costs. And those costs are going to be passed on in the form of higher grocery store prices and a lot of other things. But, to try to put it in context in terms of this being a global market, let me share my screen and show you a couple pictures. The first one I didn't create, but the second one, or the ones after that, I did create. So let me start by showing you this. So this is the price for three different oil markets. The Brent market, which is North Sea oil, West Texas Intermediate from Cushing, and then the spot price for West Texas Intermediate. What you should notice is that these oil prices move together. To the extent that one of them is higher, it's the price of Brent in the North Sea. And the point I'm trying to make here is that even though we don't buy a lot of oil from Russia, think of it as we're all pieces of a chain. And yes, we may not be directly linked to Russia, but the Russian market is linked to the European market and the British market. And the British market and the European market is linked to us. And there's this chain links us all together. And if you look at these prices, you'll notice that they move together. So the next point is to look at how oil relates to gas. Now, I know that we were talking about how gas prices stayed high last week, even though oil prices came down a little bit. And there is a lot of variation on a week-to-week basis. But if you look at it on a month-to-month, the correlation is something like 98%. And so this is, for example, looking at the North Sea oil price in black, and here I've adjusted for inflation, compared to regular gasoline and diesel, and it's pretty highly correlated. And the changes are month to month. I can also show this another way in terms of how much oil makes up of the price of gasoline. What I did was I took the price of a barrel of oil, I divided by 55, because there's 55 gallons in a barrel. And so how much of its oil prices, and you can see that there is a markup, right? There's refining cost and distribution cost, and there's profit for the oil companies, but that there's a pretty strong correlation between what's going on in oil prices and what's going on in gas prices. So another thing that as Americans, we don't really appreciate is how cheap our gas is. So this is from March 7th. So it's a couple weeks ago, but you see here that the average US price was a little over $4 a gallon. Norway, Hong Kong, partly because they have very expensive currencies, it was more like $10 a gallon. But you can see that most European countries are paying something closer to $8 a gallon. So yes, we're more expensive than Mexico or the United Arab Emirates or Saudi Arabia or Venezuela, which you can't find gas, but if you can find it, it's really cheap. And more expensive than Russia. But compared to most of the developed world, we have fairly cheap gas. Now, that, of course, has led us to be much more wasteful in how we use it, right? We drive huge pickup trucks. They don't really do that in Europe. If you've traveled there, you might notice that. And I also wanted to show you prices by state. I said that Nevada has relatively high prices. So people talk about the average American price of gasoline. the red line here is gasoline, and the yellow bit on top is the markup for diesel. And this is again as of like a week ago. And so you can see Nevada in the blue column over on the very far side. You know, we have one of the highest gas prices in the country. There's a lot of places that have much cheaper gas than we do. They're complaining just as we are. So it's not like, you know, they're all happy. No, nobody likes paying more for gas. And I think that was the main graphs I wanted to hit. The last one I guess I wanted to say is that the increase in the price of oil and the price of gas is in addition to problems we were already having with rising prices, not just in the US, but in Europe in many places. And one of the areas that rose in price the most was anything related to fuels. So this graph goes back to 1990 and shows what's happened to world production of crude oil. And you can see down at the bottom, the United States, because of the new fracking technologies, doubled its production. And basically the US became the world's largest producer of oil. We still import some because we still consume more than we produce, but nonetheless, we're a huge producer. You can see Russia is the second biggest producer. And so pulling Russia out of that market has a big effect, right? Then we see Saudi Arabia, Canada, China, then 5 countries that have smaller shares, including Iran and the United Arab Emirates. 5 countries had even smaller share, and then 29 other countries that produce oil. Now, if you look at the overall, you see that in 2020, there was a huge decline in oil production. And of course, what caused that was the pandemic led people to stop driving for a few months. And inventories built up. They had no place to put the oil. So they started cutting back production. And cutting back production in petroleum is not like just turning a spigot on and off. Not only is it hard to get oil out of the ground and change that, but there's the whole supply chain network, the distribution, the getting people to drive it from place to place, the having the ships that can move it from country to country. So recovering from that is hard. Now, the 2021 data was not in yet, but it looks like it's going to recover about half the loss of 2020. So people started driving again in 2021 all over the world. They started buying more gasoline all over the world, but there wasn't enough oil being produced to meet that. And of course, what happens in a market is prices go up. So people were already upset about that. And then here comes the invasion of Ukraine and the idea that we're going to try to slowly wean ourselves, not just in the United States, but in Europe and elsewhere, we're going to wean ourselves off of Russian oil. So I will stop sharing at that point and throw it out to everybody else.
Well, first of all, Professor, thank you for that. I just learned a whole bunch. So I know, I hope our viewers at home did as well. And if y'all have questions for any of our fabulous speakers tonight, please put them in the chat so that this way we can get to all of our questions at the end of the show tonight. And there are no dumb questions on this. We are doing this so you all can learn how the gas prices work, how our economy works, and really the truth behind gas prices in this country. And I think that presentation was excellent to kind of set the stage for this. So Professor Parker, I want to start with you in terms of our questions for this evening. You know, the Biden administration has pointed out that oil companies have what they need to increase oil production beyond the record highs they are already reaching, but they simply aren't doing it. If anything, they are artificially inflating the price despite this high supply. What factors go into determining what the price per gallon of gas is at the pump, and how can the federal government rein in this alleged gouging that oil and gas companies are perpetuating?
Well, I'll start by saying I'm not a fan of monopolies. You know, my wife used to work in antitrust and actually worked for us.
Tell everybody who your wife is,
okay.
Too. She's literally friend of the show and our favorite person in the world.
My wife is Kate Marshall, and so she works for the Biden administration, and you may know her as the former lieutenant governor. So she used to work at the Department of Justice and Antitrust, and we see eye to eye on many things related to monopoly behavior. And so I'm not trying to excuse that. I also want to do not a true confessions exactly, but a context. When I got out of college, I'm from Texas. I got out of college. I went to work for a small oil company. They were more of a driller, but our biggest competition was Halliburton, and we hated them. So I still hate Halliburton. So now that company went out of business. I think they got bought out by the French oil firm Schlumberger. So they no longer exist. But let me back up to answer your question about the price gouging and all that. So I'm going to go back to my screen for a second. I want to go back and look at those prices because I think it helps to understand something that happened. The United States became a big producer, and fracking was part of that, right? So we started producing a lot of oil there, and we did it at a time after the Great Recession. Does my cursor show up on the screen right here?
It does.
So this period was when oil prices were relatively high. Again, this graph adjusts for inflation. And so a lot of investment went into fracking and expanding oil production in the United States. And then notice what happened in 2014. There's a big drop in oil prices. And so there's a lot of those smaller producers, not the Exxon Mobils and all the rest, but the producers of oil, the smaller firms, many of them were losing a lot of money in that because they were expecting oil prices to be up here and they turned out to be down here. And so what's happened in the run up in prices, especially after about 2020, especially, because a lot of us are starting to think, well, maybe we need to look to a post fossil fuel future, is that Wall Street's been pushing many of these companies to start giving out dividends and paying down their debts rather than expanding production. But that misses a huge part of the picture because that's only the United States firms. So we go back to that other graph I showed you in terms of oil production. And what you've seen is it's not the US that cut back on production as much, right? I mean, 2020 was down for Russia, really down for Saudi Arabia, right? And so you look at the decline here in 2020, it was much bigger than the United States. And what we're expecting in terms of the recovery is we're expecting the US is going to be increasing production, but even if we did, it's not going to change this. What we need is the rest of, if we want oil prices to be cheap again, we would need the rest of the world to respond. And in fact, we see some evidence that they're starting to, right? That the higher prices are inducing many of them to start increasing production. So we like to think of the United States like we're the only country in the world, right? And that what goes on in the US and what US firms do determines everything about the price. But these prices are all linked together, right? It's one big global market, and we're only 20% of it. And so, yes, I don't like monopolies, but the oil market is much less concentrated than it used to be back when I worked in that industry, right? And like I said, even OPEC doesn't have the power they used to have. There's a lot of countries producing it. There's a lot of firms that are producing. So it's not just a handful of American companies controlling the price. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I'm a believer in what's called Occam's razor, right? So, I don't want to oversimplify things, right? The old saying is there's always two sides to every story. One of them is simple, clear, and wrong. But even if you say, well, things are complicated, when you're trying to explain what's going on, it's often easier to go for the answer that requires the fewest assumptions. That's called Occam's razor, right? So this can be adequately explained by what happened with the pandemic and what happened with the incentives of the market itself without adding the extra complexity of monopoly behavior. I do think that's there, but I also think that that's more of a secondary effect. It's more of a symptom than the cause itself. And I'll stop sharing.
Thank you.
Please tell me my mic was on for all that, because that
it was, and it was fantastic. And I was listening to you preach the gospel. So I have a very, I'm known for kind of being direct and blunt. I'm sure your wife has told you about this. So I want to ask a very direct question. There is a lot of conspiracy theories out there that Joe Biden himself has a magic button on his desk, and he is saying, I'm going to flip this switch and our gas prices are going to go through the roof. That is not real, correct?
Yeah, right. It's like there's old joke about, conspiracy theories about professors, right? We're indoctrinating our students into liberal beliefs. And most professors will tell you, we can't even get them to read the syllabus, right? I mean, to me, the biggest concern about the oil companies isn't what's happening with the prices. It's the way they use their profits to try to affect US policy, right? It's the dark money that flows into trying to influence our Congress critters and get them to not do policies that we really need to wean ourselves off of greenhouse gases. That's the problem with those companies, right? That to me is the big issue. The question is, we have a private market. This is a capitalist country. And Joe Biden, as far last I looked, the United States is not a major producer of oil. I mean, the government. Saudi Arabia, they have Aramco, right? There's a number of countries around the world. Mexico has Pemex, right? Malaysia has a state-owned oil company. We don't have any state-owned oil companies. And Biden, President Biden, he can't even get Republicans in Congress to vote for a really good bill like Build Back Better. How the hell's he going to get, CEOs in major oil companies who are almost indubitably Republicans to go ahead and somehow do what he tells them in terms of cutting back production? I mean, it's absurd. But let's go one more than that. I'm sorry I'm beating this question to death. But going back to our price graph, right? Look at 2008. Now, who was president in 2008? It wasn't Obama, right? So did George Bush have a magic button that made prices go up? No, it was driven by the world market. It was driven by China's economy growing really rapidly, right? So there's things going on at the time. George Bush wasn't responsible for that. Right? Who was president back in 73 when we had the OPEC oil embargo? Right? It wasn't Carter, it was Nixon and then Ford. Right? Were they responsible for that? I don't think so. So it's a global market. If you believe in markets, then you have to accept that this is happening because the market is working. If you don't believe in markets and you want to have a state-owned oil company, fine, say that. But your understanding of how politics works and how much power the president has over private markets and large firms, if that's your argument, it's hard to believe that you believe it, right? I think you're just saying it because you think somebody else might believe it. Sorry, am I being too direct?
No. Thank you for bringing the receipts to prove what I have been saying. And it's insane to me that these are even conversations that we have to have at this point, but I guess we're here.
Well, they feel so disingenuous, right?
Yes.
I don't feel like it's a real argument because I don't feel like there's any real evidence behind it. It's an inconsistent argument. And again, if you believe in markets, and generally I'm an economist, I see there are very good things that markets can do, right? Not everything they do is great, but majority I'm in support of. And if you believe in markets, this is what's supposed to happen. If you pull Russia out of the market, you're going to see prices rise.
So Annie Black, if you're watching at home today, which God, I hope you are, to maybe learn something, anything, you heard it from the professor who has a degree in economics that Joe Biden and Stephen Horsford do not have a magic button they can just flip on and increase our gas prices. So you're wrong, and you probably should read a book. Okay, I'd like to go to...
That was direct.
I'd like to go to former professor of environmental policies, Liz Becker, who created this show for us tonight. Liz, I want to bring you in. Like I said, you helped us create the show tonight. You own an electric vehicle, and you wanted us to do this show because you also wanted to talk about moving away from our reliance on fossil fuels. moving away from our reliance on fossil fuels because of climate change, which we also believe in here, and making sure that it's fair and equitable for all people to have access to those things. So tell us what you have seen with your electric vehicle recently. I know you've done a lot of math around this, and why you thought we should tackle this critical issue right now.
Thank you so much, Annette. And you give me too much credit. I really just called you and was angry and was like, let's do this show. I'm going to send you an email. But let me just take it back to when I was teaching environmental science. I was at UNLV. I was really involved in campus climate stuff. I have my throwback shirt on, Campus Climate Challenge. And I knew when I was teaching that class that there wasn't a reason besides economic reasons that I definitely do not understand as well as Dr. Parker, but I knew that there was not a scientific reason why we couldn't be speeding up this transition to electric vehicles even then. So there was a movie that came out in 2006 called Who Killed the Electric Car? And I'm sure that many of your watchers and many of you all have seen it. And, spoiler alert, it was the companies that produce oil, because they did not want electric vehicles to be on the market. And GM was producing electric cars that anyone could purchase that were lower priced. And actually they were leasing them because they didn't want people to own them. And people loved them. And then all of a sudden GM destroyed the entire fleet of electric vehicles and said, oh, never mind. We don't really want people to know that everybody could be driving an electric vehicle and not be a slave to going to the gas station. And I remember I watched this movie, I shared it with my class, and I'm friends with a man named Steve Ripka, who I know a lot of you probably also know, and we would just talk about this all the time. And as the time has passed since then, that was 16 years ago, I just got more and more angry that car companies were not bringing these vehicles to market. And furthermore, that politicians were not acknowledging that the subsidies that they give to oil companies are not necessary economically in any way, shape, or form, and they should be giving subsidies so that people who can't afford a Tesla or the Roadster that came out first that was $80,000 or $120,000, that's what we should be doing to get people to move. And I'm so grateful that we live in Nevada and we have a renewable energy portfolio standard and we are moving towards putting in charging stations. But in that interim time, I did a whole lot of just being frustrated and trying to understand why people weren't moving away. And it's because we're just captive to these organizations, these corporations who play around with their greenwashing, like British Petroleum being beyond petroleum for like a year and then realizing that hurt their gas sales and then they don't want to do that anymore. And it's just so infuriating when it can work. So in 2016, I said, you know what? I'm going to go buy an electric vehicle. I do not have a lot of expendable income. So I went to CarMax and purchased a RAV4 that they only made 2,600 of. And Tesla and Toyota made them together. So they have Tesla batteries. And I just purchased it at CarMax and it cost the equivalent amount of what I would have been paying anyway. And it's all electric and no one knows that this car exists. Every time I drive this car somewhere, people are like, what do you mean it's all electric? It's a RAV4. And I'm like, yes. And, now I'm just so happy that there's so many more options, but I just find myself always trying to one-on-one talk to people. And I mean, we're beyond that now. We have to address the climate crisis and we're beyond these one-on-one conversations. What can you do, to decrease your carbon footprint? No, it's what can our government do to speed this transition and what can all the governments in the world do? And that's why I'm here for this conversation.
So Liz, talk to us about the math that you have done just on your electric vehicle in the past month or so, as we've seen oil prices kind of spike up. And let's talk about that math and how much people could be saving if electric vehicles, if other means of decarbonization were more accessible to people maybe who are low income, who are communities of color, because that's really the challenge, right? Is that this is not accessible yet to all people. I cannot, even though I love a Rivian and my husband and I nerd out about them all the time, I work for a nonprofit he works for a cranberry company. We can't just go out and buy a Rivian tomorrow. It is not accessible to us. So talk about the cost savings you would have and how that could be multiplied, and also how it's so much better for the environment if people could do what you did.
Yes, and I'm going to preface what I'm about to say with, I understand the privilege that it takes to have this conversation, because if I were a single mother living in an apartment complex, I couldn't own the car I had, because I wouldn't be able to plug it in, because I wouldn't be able to put in that charging station that I have in my garage that needs a 240 volt plug. So there are a whole lot of equity issues that we have to tackle that are separate from, how can each individual person switch over to an electric vehicle? But these numbers are numbers that will work for a lot of people who I do hear constantly complaining about gas prices. I see them roll up to my daughter's school in an Expedition, and they get out and they're like, oh, I just had to pay $180 for my tank of gas. And I'm like, how many gallons does that hold? And what's your MPG? Because I know what it is, and you are lying when you say you personally can't afford an electric car. So what I did is, it's kind of hard to compare just MPG to how many kilowatt hours it takes to drive miles in an electric car, but I did that little conversion. So I looked at how often I was driving, and I'm driving a lot more, as all of us are, since we've started, our kids go back to school, we've had to go into the office. So I'm driving about 1,000 miles per month, and the RAV4 gets 2.5 miles on average per kilowatt hour. So you have to know how much your kilowatt hours cost. And I am in a program that NV Energy offers to anyone who has an electric vehicle. You don't pay extra for it or anything, and it's called time of use charging, where they charge you less at nighttime to charge your car. So I only pay 5 cents a kilowatt hour at night, which is cheaper. Most people are paying 8 or 9 cents a kilowatt hour most of the time. The way that they recoup their money is they charge you almost 36 cents a kilowatt hour from 1 to 7 in the summer during the months you have your air conditioner on. So they're not really losing any money, except with crazy people like myself who turn their air to 85 from 1 to 7. But most people aren't going to do that either. So if it costs 5 cents a kilowatt hour, then that comes out to, I need about 400 kilowatt hours a month to charge my car for the whole month. That only cost me $21. So I drive the entire month in my car that does not take gasoline. It only is charging for $21. So that's an annual cost of about $253. The equivalent car to mine, which is a 2013 RAV4 regular gasoline powered car, gets 26 miles per gallon average. So if gasoline is $4.80 a gallon, and I just kind of use that number, I think it's actually more than that right now. If you drove 1,000 miles in a month, then you would be paying $185 a month. I pay 21, I would be paying 185. And that's a cost savings per year of almost $2,000. And I've had my vehicle for 6 years. Hopefully it's never going to stop working because I love it. But these are the kind of numbers that people who constantly complain about gasoline prices, I think they need to just listen, because 26 miles per gallon is actually pretty decent fuel economy in comparison to these big, huge trucks and SUVs that people are driving that get 12, 15 miles per gallon. But for other people who are driving something already that gets pretty good gas mileage, in the 30s for like a Honda Civic type car, you're still going to be seeing a savings that's at more than $1,000 a year. So it's impactful to be able to share numbers with people. And believe me, I proselytize on the playground after school all the time.
So Liz, the next question for you is, there's obviously been a lot of headlines lately about how people are upset or anxious about our rising gas prices. Mm-hmm. So as an electric vehicle owner, how do your expenses for charging your car compare with when you relied on filling up your vehicle with gas? So just like in your own household, how does it compare right now?
So I don't have a direct comparison with my husband's vehicle because he actually drives a work vehicle and he also works from home and he does not drive as much as I do. But if I were to compare it to what I owned, if what I owned had gas, then it would be a savings of $160 a month. And I mean, $160 a month is a significant amount of money. And I know a lot of people who I know can't just go purchase, an electric vehicle, because even on the used market, they are so hard to get right now because everyone wants one, and the new cars really are not out yet. But I also have solar panels that I did not pay for. I lease solar panels, and there is no upfront cost, and I have to pay the company that I lease them from a certain amount per month, and that's it. I paid zero upfront costs, and the amount of energy that my solar panels produce is roughly equivalent to how much I need to charge my car every day. And so I can feel like my solar panels are directly charging my vehicle, and I don't have to pay that extra amount to NV Energy to charge my car.
So this is a good question that came in from the chat, Liz, and I think it's an important thing to put in context before we move to Maria and the decarb report, because it kind of all links together. So Delo Joe in the chat asks his question of, how is the power generated to charge your car? And in the state of Nevada, we actually no longer have coal plants that are fueling our energy consumption. Thank goodness. They've gone out of use, and we have gotten rid of them. So how is the power in Nevada primarily created for the energy that we use here in Nevada, the energy that you use to fuel your car?
So as I stated, my energy at my house is produced by my solar panels, and but most people are connected to the grid. And like you said, proud of us phasing out the coal power. A lot of people think that our power comes from the dam, and that is not true. Most of the energy from the dam actually goes to California. But if you look at the pie of the entire country, right now, Nevada has the ability to produce all the energy that we could possibly need from solar, wind, and geothermal. And up north, geothermal is a large slice of the pie, which is excellent. And we have really good wind and solar resources. And that's what we're looking to expand out into the future. Because right now, natural gas does provide power still here. And I listened to this great podcast. If anyone is interested in being a total energy geek, it's called the Energy Transition Show. And the entire premise is, how do we transition away from fossil fuels? And it's every single tiny thing you need to know about how we transition away, with the shows having their own subject. And there's so many moving parts. And I know Dr. Parker can wrap his mind around this too as an economist, because when one thing happens, when Russia drops off and we're not getting their oil anymore, it affects prices in every single country. And the same thing is going to go for once we start adding all of this solar capacity, because NV Energy wants to add huge solar fields. And eventually we're going to produce more energy than we can use, and we're going to be transmitting that energy across state lines. And that's a whole other topic, energy transmission, that I love to talk about. But we're in the perfect scenario in Nevada to be able to produce all of our energy with renewables easily, and then use that, for tax revenue, really, to be able to sell it to other states. So we're in a good position, but there's a lot of work, and there's always going to be that work. But I would agree with Dr. Parker that the biggest reason we don't have these things now is because of the way that dark money works in our country. And all of these fossil fuel companies have always funded politicians that will vote to not take away what they already have. And capitalism can do some good things, I guess. I'm not the hugest fan, but one of the things about capitalism that you can't build into the system is altruism. And if companies have shareholders, they're going to be giving money to their shareholders any way that they possibly can, and altruism does not factor in for them. So if it's going to be cheaper to do it with renewables, that's how they're going to do it. But if it's not going to be cheaper, then good luck getting large corporations to make the switch.
Thank you for that, Liz. And for our viewers at home, we put the podcast that Liz was talking about in the chat. So this way y'all can go on and listen to it, because I think that's an excellent resource. All right, Maria, I want to bring you in. Obviously, you and our partner groups have done a tremendous amount of work on our decarbonization report. I see the cover page of that report behind you, so good job. Talk to us about the decarbonization report and why we put it together and what the findings were in that report and why it's so important for us to start talking about this, especially talking about these, the decarbonization process being equitable, being fair, and being accessible to all people, especially communities of color.
Yeah, hi, boss. And hi, everyone. Maria Teresa here, the sometimes substitute teacher for when Annette is out. So I wanted folks to check out what you're talking about, which you'll see this picture. If you clicked on the link that we'll put in the chat, breathefreenevada.com. Well, NV for Nevada, breathefreenv.com. And that is the decarbonization report that Annette, you just mentioned, and that we were very proud to be a part of, and a part of releasing it to the community and to releasing it to our legislature. We presented this report to legislators before it was made public back when they were in session. And essentially, this is a report that shows a lot of things, but I'm going to keep it to the subject of the transportation issues. But it really shows that low-income communities, and many of those are often, more often than not, BIPOC, which is Black, Indigenous, people of color, are not able to access electric vehicles, electric public transportation, much less any public transportation, that we need to actually work on incentivizing people in those low income communities to have access, and that we need to have the infrastructure to have charging stations in those communities. Like, for example, this report, there's a really cool graph. It's very long, so you'll have to scroll, but there is a graph in there that shows you where, for example, electric charging stations for electric vehicles are. And there's a lot more that have been built. And I think, there's programs where we're trying to get, things built in places that aren't shopping malls or places on the strip. Because right now, according to this report, and if you just kind of like go around town, like in my head, I think Town Square, Springs Preserve, the strip, and obviously you can do it at home, but for some people that's not possible. If I live in an apartment, I'm gonna have to find a place to go charge my car. And so this report, that's just one thing that really stands out for me in relation to this. But overall, what this report really was, and the groups that were a part of it, is that we need to ensure that in order to fight climate change, in order to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and remove ourselves from fossil fuels and et cetera, we need to work on decarbonization, and we need to reduce pollution that harms our health, also reduces energy costs for families, and increases our independence and resilience. Because the more we go to, like Liz said, the wind and geothermal and solar, those are things we have here. Like, I'm literally looking at the sun. And so that makes us resilient and it makes us independent. And we need to act now, because as we have heard from Liz, and I remember hearing it when I was a college kid and George Bush was president, and many people were like, gas prices are so high, we need to, get on the electric vehicle bus. And it didn't really happen until now. It's happening. And so we have a lot of catch-up work to do. And that's what this report shows us, that we have a lot to catch up on, but it is possible. So if folks want to see the full recommendations, and we'll talk more about them, but that is all in that breathefreenv.com.
And Maria, the Biden administration is estimating that families could see gas bills drop by $80 per month, but just by switching to an electric vehicle. Do you think greater incentives coupled with high gas prices might spur an increase in electric vehicles being adopted? And what do we need to do to make electric vehicles more accessible outside of even just the charging stations? because we know that the prices and, like Liz was saying, the secondary market is not even a real option for most people right now. So like, how do we get this moving and how can we incentivize these things?
Yeah, so I think I have lots of opinions about this because I'm someone that now finally I have a hybrid vehicle, which is great. But it was the only one in the lot. It's a Hyundai and it was the only one in the lot. And the car that I really wanted, they didn't even have. It's one that has solar that Hyundai is like testing out. So one, we need to make them available and we need to make them affordable. And sometimes, you know, you need the government to say, hey, manufacturers, companies, you need to do that because yes. So the other thing, you know, so there's this misconception that, you know, just not just anyone can go buy an electric vehicle for many reasons. One, even if it's with a manufacturer or even a hybrid vehicle, sometimes there's less of them. And if they have them, sometimes, usually they're more expensive, or, you know, people are also, frankly, as someone that comes from a low income background for most of my life, are intimidated by it and intimidated by the process. And so that's why we need to make sure that we're actually focusing on this community, on these communities. One thing that you'll see in the report, and that the report points out, is that we have a transition and we have usage of electric vehicles in Nevada, and you can see the hotspots where electric vehicles are used based on data that they have. But they pointed out most of this is in wealthier areas, in wider areas, in wealthier areas. That's because they have the access, economic, or many others, to actually get those vehicles, whereas low-income folks do not. So this is something that we have talked a lot about, especially with our partners at Chispa, Nevada. So if Chispa or Rudy, you're watching, but this is one of the things we've talked about, that when you are talking about we need to give incentives, you need to make sure that those incentives are going to prioritize low-income communities, are going to prioritize people that and families that need it, because this report also shows that it's low-income communities and families that pay more for transportation costs than wealthier families. And not necessarily because of the car that they're driving, but also because public transportation is so hard to find here that you end up spending so much money on, I don't know if folks know, but like you have to spend a lot of money to get just a 1-day pass or like a 30-day pass for the CAT bus. And a lot of people rely on that. And so they're forking over lots of money to get those passes to be able to go to work or go to school and back and forth. And you know, that those are the communities that we need to make sure. So I think when we're making policy, whether it's at the state level or at the national level, we need to make sure we are asking people that represent those communities and have those communities' interest at heart to be part of the conversation, to be part of the especially the conversation. I know we set aside from the charging stations, but it's like an oddly important part of the discussion, because, and you know, we kind of talked about this with certain solar panel installations and things like that, where we passed policy and we wanted to make sure it was in certain areas. This report also recommends, when we're talking about charging station infrastructure, you need to have members of the community to tell you, no one drives to that part of town, or like nobody from my community actually lives or works there. So that's not a good spot for this charging station. Maybe you should find a place close to Eastern and Bonanza or something like that. You know, so that, I know I just kind of rambled on, but those are things that you'll see in this report that constantly resonate. It's that low-income people are suffering the brunt, and they're not being seen as part of the solution, and they're not being prioritized in the solutions, and they need to be. And it needs to be fast, because they're the ones that can't afford it. have to pay more out of pocket, and et cetera, et cetera.
Thank you, Maria. So I want to go back to Professor Parker. So inevitably, the only long-term solution to our dependence on oil imports and fossil fuels and domestic drilling on our public lands, yada, 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 is going to be a transition to clean, renewable energy. How can the Biden administration thread the needle of hastening that transition while also keeping energy costs relatively low for American consumers?
Well, I'm not totally sure you can do both, but I would say that from what I've seen of the Build Back Better bill that was passed, that was passed by the House of Representatives, but died in the Senate in the fall. And, it's been negotiated and then mostly killed. That had a lot, I think. It wouldn't have been a perfect solution, but it would have been a really good first step. Now, for 20 years, at least, in my principles of economics class, I've used as part of economic principles the idea of how we could use a tax structure to basically pay closer to European taxes and then give it back to people in other ways, so that it wasn't just simply more money going to the government, which people worry about, but reduce certain taxes, increase fuel taxes, and don't do it dramatically overnight, because it's going to take time for people to transition. It's going to take time for people to buy the electric car. It's going to take time for people to do that. And, it's going to take time to develop public transportation. But one of the things we need to make it happen is more demand, not just by lower income people who can't afford a car, but for others. So you go to a bigger city, you go to Seattle, for example, you've got a much better public transportation system because middle-class people take the bus. Whereas in Reno, for example, it's pathetic. There's just not enough demand and not enough reliability. And so it's going to take time to transition, but you need to give people the expectation. So what we should have done 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 40 years ago, is to say, okay, once we've had this crisis and we've seen oil prices jump again, for example, 2008, or go back to 1974, 75, or 1979, 80, and say, okay, we've seen the writing on the wall. Let's say 10 years from now, we're going to be really increasing the cost of gasoline through taxes. And then we're going to give it back to people in other ways, and then give people time to transition, right? Give people time to make those adjustments because they know they're coming. But we can't do that now because we have a political system in which we have a 50-50 Senate. And even that 50-50 Senate isn't really 50-50, because we know that, Democrats can be a fractious bunch on occasion. We have people from energy producing states who are nervous about it. And so, if we could get the political will to do it, that'd be wonderful. But we can't. And so the only way to do that is that voters become educated and voters pressure the national government to do it. But let's also remember that while we produce 20% of the world's oil, we consume more than that. And while we're a large part of the solution, we are not the only solution. Nevada is only 1% of the national economy and much smaller fraction of the world economy. We need China to do it. We need India to do it, right? We need other countries to do it. And so we also need a government that can work better with other countries, right? That knows how to play well with other countries and can try to bring them to agreement on this issue. And, I had, and I still have, hopes for the Biden administration for this, but it's just we keep having other things like, I don't know, the pandemic, the Ukrainian invasion that keep getting in the way. But, I believe that the administration has a much greater ability, and I think they've shown this in the last couple of months, to bring countries together for what is in their mutual interest. And so really that's what we need, is to get all countries to do it. And Americans in the long run, we need to pay much higher prices, more like European prices. But again, not in a way that hurts people, because you need to give it back to them in other ways, right? So the low income people are not being killed by this. Rural people are not being killed by this, but if you live in a rural area, you got to drive a lot. And so having some way of making that doable we have to consider that.
Thank you for
Did
that.
I
Liz,
answer your question?
you did. Liz, I saw you come off mute. Do you want to add to that?
Oh, I'm very excited because it sounds like Dr. Parker supports carbon fee and dividend. And I know that somebody else asked about that, and I need to know about that and how feasible you think it is, if we could really do it, because it really excites me. I want to see it because, like you said, we need to raise taxes in a way that doesn't hurt individuals. And if we raise taxes on carbon and then give people money back, then it really isn't raising their money for their fuel, because they could use that dividend for fuel.
I'm pretty sure I read this proposal for basically the equivalent of carbon taxes, fuel tax, et cetera, and any producing things. I read it in a Council of Economic Advisors report back when I was in graduate school. And just to put it in context, I've been at UNR for 30 years, right? So it's been a while. So it's not like economists are just going, oh, look at this idea. It's like they've been saying it. Environmental economists have been saying this for years. We need to incentivize it. You can't ask people to individually try to do it, because individually we can have no effect, right? If you drive an electric car, it might save you money, but it's not going to have any impact on global warming, right, or climate change. We all have to do it. And to make that work, to make it in our self-interest, because you talked about how we don't do altruism very well, and that's just human nature, unfortunately. We have to incentivize it, right? And no better way to incentivize it than say, yeah, if you're going to be producing greenhouse gases, you have to start paying for it, right? You don't get to make other people pay for it, right? An efficient market is one where you pay your costs. And none of us are willing to say, run our cars so that the tailpipe exits into the passenger cabin, right? So we get to breathe the crap that we're pouring into the atmosphere. If we did, we might be a little more cognizant of the impact we have on other people. But what we do is we put our costs on other people, right? So we don't have to pay the costs that we put on society. Economists have known this since, 120 years ago. Arthur Cecil Pigou argued for these kind of corrective taxes. So these are old ideas. It's just, there's no reason why we can't do it except politics.
Love it. Thank you for that. Okay, I want to get to a few audience questions because we've got a lot tonight. So if y'all have questions at home, please put them in the chat now. Now's a great time to do that. We have some time for a couple of questions because this has been a super interesting panel this evening. All right, so Shelby has a question, and we can do this popcorn style. Any of you can join in. How do governments / people of places where gas prices are incredibly high, $10 plus a gallon, handle that cost? And are they more reliable on public transportation and other more, renewable sources, basically? Go ahead.
So yes, of course, higher prices, what you find is that people are more likely to live close to work. They're more likely to have really good public transportation. They're more likely to ride bicycles. They're more likely to drive smaller vehicles, right? All that happens and people adjust. Now, the problem, of course, is the transition. The adjustment is difficult. We've relied on cheap gas for decades and decades. And so we've designed our cities in a way that's full of sprawl, right? There's very little incentive to have public transportation because only the poor in areas like Las Vegas or Reno want to use it. And they don't, that it becomes hard to distribute that cost, and the taxpayers don't want to fund it. But if there were a lot of people who said, well, it's a lot better than driving, then we do it. The problem is, again, we put so much infrastructure into a badly designed, set of communities that it's really hard to change on a dime that way. But you've got to start. And that's why transitioning slowly over time but in a way that says this is going to happen and take some time to get used to it. I think that is the better approach. But again, we can't just do this quickly because we'd hurt a lot of people.
Yes, I agree. And it's funny because I saw that question in the chat and I was thinking, oh, yes, it's because they have better public transportation. And that didn't just happen.
Right. It's cause and effect.
Right. And like urban planning is a huge thing that the United States has been bad at for the most part. And European cities are better at it. I think one reason is because they're older and they have a smaller area in which that they can expand. And especially here in Las Vegas, when people first came here, when white people first came here, and they saw that there was just this expanse. Oh, let's just build whatever we want and expand in any way that we want. And there was no planning. And, you know, the car companies ripped up rail lines. They wanted people to drive cars. And in a lot of these countries, they have had long-standing public transportation that's been better than anything that we have had for, you know, decades. So we have to do better on the urban planning. And I know that our county commission is trying to do better with that. And I've been excited about that. So that's important.
A little piece of trivia, if I may. If you go back and look at European oil consumption prior to the 70s, it more or less tracked. I mean, it wasn't exactly equal to, but it more or less tracked the growth and direction of US oil consumption. But what you see starting in the mid-1970s is that European oil consumption flattened and the United States oil consumption kept growing. Now, a lot of that is because the European governments, and after the OPEC oil crisis, woke up and saw the writing on the wall and says we need to move away from that. The US was the outlier in that sense. So our demand hasn't grown. You know, the nice part is our economy has grown much faster than our oil demand. We are much more oil efficient relative to GDP than we used to be, right? You know, so there's been, it's not all bad news, but Europe went much further and they took the lesson that was there for the reading and they took it and we did not.
Thank you for that. This is another great question. This comes from Richard. He said, one thought I've had, and I've actually had this thought myself sometimes, is that the oil companies are in collusion with the GOP to keep prices artificially high in an effort to, I don't know this word, cajole the Dems with pain at the pump in November. Am I nuts? And I think that's, you know, there's obviously no conspiracy there, but you talk about Halliburton, and we all know Halliburton having a connection to the Bush administration, right? And these oil companies obviously are big donors of the GOP. Like that is no secret. So how does all that work? And is Richard nuts?
So Liz, Maria Teresa, can I take a shot? So close. And what I would say is not exactly that, because the way the question was worded presumes that oil prices are artificially high. And I would argue they're artificially low. Because we're subsidizing it, right? We've restructured our society in such a way as to make it so much easier, right? Whereas Europe hasn't done that. But the other part, of course, is that we've tried to argue that governments don't have the power to control those prices. So that's the part that I want to set aside. But what I think you're also getting at is this idea that oil companies have an incentive to try to fight against policies that would wean us off of oil, right? The whole arguments that have been made by Liz and others, you know, about efforts to disincentivize electric cars and other things. And I think that is real. I don't think that they're trying to get oil prices high before the election, because I don't think they have the power to do that. But I do think that they try to keep Americans, and we're the world's largest consumer of petroleum, to try to keep American demand high. And that's more long-term thing, and that has a lot to do with policies. And it's not in their self-interest to do otherwise.
Right.
Did that
All right.
seem like a fair answer, Liz?
I think that's very fair. So a couple other questions, and Liz, I'm going to pass this one to you. I do know that this is happening with Rivian now. Rivian does have this, but I'm going to let you talk about it more in depth. So Rivian actually has a vehicle that is now all-wheel drive for those watching at home, which is kind of cool. And it's a truck, so it actually could, it literally rotates in a circle. By the way, for those at home who have never watched it, if you've never watched the show Long Way Up, it talks about all of these issues regarding range anxiety, regarding electric vehicles being reliable in cold weather and warm weather. Ewan McGregor and his best friend basically go on a long bike ride using 2 electric Harley Davidsons and Rivians as the backup cars. And they go from the tip of South America all the way to LA. And they show how there is no infrastructure built for electric vehicles, especially in those communities. And how, if we really want to move away from gas guzzling cars to electric vehicles, that's how there's a lot of issues you got to deal with. So it's a really good educational video or series on Apple Plus if you ever want to watch it. It's called Long Way Up. It's so well done, and I highly recommend it. So for you, Liz, Amber asked, are there electric vehicles that have 4-wheel drive? That might sound silly, but in areas where you get a lot of snow, especially in northern Nevada, 4-wheel drive can be important. And I'm not sure if there are electric vehicles that have 4-wheel drive. So let's talk about that.
Pretty essential in northern Nevada.
Yes. There are electric vehicles that have 4-wheel drive. So Annette mentioned the Rivian. There is also a Hummer now that's all electric. I'm very sad about this.
It's so ugly, but okay, continue.
Yes, I am not a fan of Hummers ever for any reason, but if you wanted to be toxically masculine, but not ruin the environment, you could just buy an electric Hummer. And it actually has 4 independent wheels. Instead of the wheels being on an axle where they're hooked together, it can crab walk. So the tires can move independently of each other, and it can be all 4-wheel drive. I believe the Tesla truck that's coming out, which of course is going to cost some exorbitant amount of money. Exactly, Annette. It's going to be 4-wheel drive. One of my biggest issues with all of these vehicles that are just dumping on the market because they know that there's so much demand for them at this point is they're so nice. They're so fancy and they don't need to be. Americans need affordable cars. When I purchased, when we helped my children purchase their first car, we bought them a beater with a heater. They need a car that is reliable and that isn't going to cost them a fortune in gas. And so everybody's trying to get a 20-year-old Honda Civic. But if these electric vehicle companies would just make the vehicle that Elon Musk, by the way, said he wanted to make 20 years ago, and then he never made because he said he was going to make affordable cars for the masses, and then he made the Model 3, which is not an affordable car for the masses. It's the biggest reason I'm angry with him, and I'm angry with him for a lot of reasons. But what I would say to anyone that's interested in learning about the whole variety of cars is there's a electric car show every year at the Springs Preserve, and it's actually coming up. So April the 23rd at 10 a.m., all these folks in town that have electric vehicles and also vehicles that run off of biodiesel, fuel, spent oil from restaurants and stuff like that. You can go and check out all these vehicles. April 23rd, 10 a.m., it's free, and you can just ask questions to people who love to answer your questions. They will answer any question. They don't think any of your questions are uninformed. They just want to share the gospel of having an electric vehicle with people.
And I'll add, because I too am someone who is increasingly angry with Elon Musk because of all the reasons that you just said, because he had such a great opportunity, and we could do one whole show how Elon Musk failed the universe. But
he burned every bridge. He burned all the bridges.
Literally. Mike and we had the luxury, because Teslas are ridiculously expensive, to do this cool small project, and we got to ride in a Tesla, and it is incredibly amazing and ridiculously fast and all of that. But I just constantly kept thinking, and it's something that you brought up, I don't need it to be fancy. Can you make me a model that just like runs? Like, I don't need all the bells and whistles. Easter eggs are cool, but not everybody needs Easter eggs in the computer. And also, I don't need you to make the truck like super ugly, like out of Blade Runner. Like, it just needs to be a thing that is a truck that can haul things and drive. And I think that's also the biggest thing is like, we don't need you to, we just need like the artist to just like walk away and just have like a regular design. Like, people don't need all that fancy schmancy stuff.
Exactly.
Again,
Those people are covered.
Yeah, I dream of an electric car and I cannot buy one currently. So I just want to point that out. Okay, so a few more questions. Dilo Joe asks, can I get a federal tax deduction by buying an electric vehicle? Does anybody know?
You used to be able to. Dr. Parker, you might be better up on this. I
agree, it used
you
to.
can.
I stopped paying attention to that, so I don't know if it's still there. I'm sorry, I should have looked that up, but
It's okay.
I looked up the price of oil.
Yeah, a lot of the taxes on these types of things changed under the Trump administration. So I would just Google it, honestly, because that is the best way to find that out. Let's see here.
Hang on, I took your advice and I Googled it.
Thank you.
And apparently you can. There is a federal tax credit of up to $7,500 for most electric cars. I think that's what they'll get you, is most electric cars in 2022. You can't get Tesla and General Motors. You cannot get a refund on those. So if it's a Tesla or a GM or any of its affiliates, you're not allowed. And I'll put the resource where I found that.
All right, I think this is a good one to go out with. There's a lot of questions coming in again, and Dr. Parker, I'm going to come back to you around the carbon fee and dividend and how to explain it to just like regular people. I've got like 3 or 4 questions in the chat around that. So can we just explain that? What is that in normal human terms, and why does it matter?
We need Americans and people all over the world to find other alternatives to continuing to use a lot of gasoline. And the best way to do that is to have people pay more for gasoline, but have them get the money back in other ways. And so what would happen then is the people who drive the huge truck would essentially be paying money through the government to people who don't. Because if we're all getting taxes cut or rebates in other ways, right, then those of us who make better decisions will make better income. People are worried often because they're afraid. They don't really understand what the government does in many cases, and they're afraid that if they pay more in taxes, that somehow the government will, it'll just go into a black hole. And so one way to try to reassure them of that is to try to say, look, this isn't to raise revenue, right? This is simply to get people to start taking this seriously. And the only way we can work to do this is to do it as a society, right? So we need to try to get those people who are making choices to produce a lot of greenhouse gases to, in essence, pay more so that people who make better choices can pay a lot less.
Makes sense. Okay, so I want to wrap this up. Thank you all for staying a little over with me tonight. I know we could keep talking about this for eons because so many people have questions in the chat. It's awesome. And maybe we'll do a part 2 of this. Dr. Parker, you're definitely coming back. You're full of sass and rage, just like the rest of us. So you fit in with the family. I love it. So from what I've heard tonight, and I know Maria joked about this and I'm gonna steal her joke, but like Joe Biden isn't at the gas station at 3 a.m. changing the prices with the little magnets out on the sign. Like, he's not out there changing the gas prices. This is a market. This is a chain. There's a lot of factors that go into changing gas prices, and Joe Biden and his administration are not the reason. He doesn't have a button there controlling the gas prices. That is, if that's the only thing you take away from tonight, when the GOP is out there spreading false information about gas prices, keep that in your back pocket. It's not Joe Biden. All right, I want to close with final thoughts. So, Dr. Parker, I'm going to have you go first.
Oh, okay. Final thought. Yeah, this is a really important issue, and we have to tread carefully here, because on one hand, we want to say, look, we have this long-term goal that we have to move away from the structure of our economy here. And so many of us will want to say, well, let's not waste a good crisis, right? But the problem with that is to the extent that we focus on how we might learn from this experience, some people might think that we're basically ignoring the real cost of this, almost like that there's some glee that happens because people are having to pay more out of their wallets. And I don't think that's how we feel. And so we need to not communicate that. But again, come back to the issue of Americans do care about their wallets, right? They do vote on that. But we care about the climate, but we also care about freedom and democracy. We also think that whatever you may think about climate change, we also think we do not want to be rewarding Vladimir Putin for invading Ukraine. This is good policy, even if it comes at some cost to us. Now, we can also try to ease that pain as much as possible for people who feel it harder, right? We've talked about many people who it's going to be much more expensive for them. And yes, maybe they've made bad choices and they're driving excessively big vehicles, but the system that we've had of low gas prices has sort of created that. So we need to help them move away from making bad choices too, but it's going to take time and it's going to take patience. So kind of impromptu. I didn't think about what my closing remarks would be, but that's kind of what I'd like to walk away from.
I think that's great. Liz, you want to chime in here? Final thoughts on this one of many probably episodes we will do on this in your brainchild tonight?
Yes, I would say that my spicy final comment is that fossil fuel companies have controlled our elected officials for too damn long. And I'm really excited that it seems like the tide is starting to turn. And I'm also excited that we got to talk about carbon fee and dividend, because there's just been all this talk about trickle down economics in the 80s and nothing ever trickles down, like everyone at the top just balloons their income. Carbon fee and dividend is like a rain down. And it takes something that could be a really regressive tax. It takes a carbon tax that could punish working people, and it turns it into making the playing field so much more fair. It's just so much more equitable to do it that way, because a lot of times all these vice taxes punish people at the bottom of the economic scale, whereas carbon fee and dividend punishes the people using the carbon, and it gives the people that are at the bottom end of the scale that have no other choice because our market has not given them choices, and it gives them money. So I was very happy that happened tonight. I did not think we were going to get to talk about that. So that's my final thought.
Thank you, Liz, for having this great idea. Maria Teresa, final thoughts, and specifically final thoughts around our decarb report. Remind people again how to access it. We'll put it in the chats again. But also, how do we do better with getting specifically communities of color involved in this conversation?
Well, first of all, breathefreenv.com is where you can go. You can also go there and sign up if you want to be involved with that work. And our Story Bank organizer, Brenda Rodriguez, will get you involved in the work of the decarbonization efforts that we're a part of. And we can do better by making them part of the conversation. And I think this is one thing that we are going to definitely continue to do. We started during this session with presenting this report to legislators, but really asking our elected officials when they are making decisions that will impact these communities, don't just have NV Energy make the decisions, have NV Energy Plus, or don't have the usual stakeholders, bring groups like CHISPA into the room and Faith Organizing Alliance. I think that is the one thing that just resonates when you read this report and look at the website, is that for far too long, communities of color and low-income folks have been left behind, much less brought to the table to help come up with solutions. So that's how we do better. If you are going to decide to electrify East Las Vegas, make sure that you're talking to people from East Las Vegas, right? So that they can tell you where the charging station should go and what that should look like. That's one thing. But my final closing thought is that if there are folks out there, Annie Black, whoever it might be, that watched this and thought, it's BS, I learned nothing, I would hate to live in that echo chamber where you think you know everything, because I learned a lot. And clearly we have a lot of work to do, because like Dr. Parker said, we didn't do it 20, 30 years ago. And we have a lot of work to do to catch up, but we need to do it in a way that really doesn't hurt people, and that makes sense. And I would also like to say to my wonderful person that wants to be my Congresswoman, Annie Black, it's the economy, stupid. That's what's happening. And it's not Joe Biden or Horsford or even our governor or our treasurer, Michelle Fiore, that control gas prices, because I think she alluded to that in one of her tweets. Zach Conine has nothing to do with gas prices.
We will be sure to tweet at them and let them know. Thank you for that, Maria Teresa. And thank you to this excellent panel for this conversation tonight. I think it's so important to understand how our economy works, to understand how gas prices work, so you can be educated when you see the right wing popping off on Facebook and Twitter, spewing disinformation on things like gas prices. You have a responsibility to push back on them. For the record, this was not a conversation on electric vehicles. So for those of you in the chat who are popping off, this wasn't for you. This was a conversation about gas prices and how they work, because the right wing is out there spewing misinformation about gas prices rising and why they're rising. And again, Joe Biden isn't at your gas pump overnight up there putting up the little signs changing the prices. He does not have a magic switch, and neither does Steve Sisolak. Gas prices are connected to the economy, and the economy, as Professor Parker explained, is connected to other countries as well. So it's a little more complex than a button on Joe Biden's desk. So that's what we wanted to explain tonight. So I want to thank all of you for joining us. I want to thank all of you at home for joining us, and thank our distinguished panel for being on tonight. Please check out our Decarb report. It has a lot of really important, good information in it. And we will definitely be having these guests back again soon. We are going to have an exciting out in front next week. I'm so excited about this. Next week is Transgender Week of Visibility, and we are going to have Cy from Gender Justice on to talk about transgender issues in Nevada. So make sure you join us. We'll be live at 5 next Thursday, just like we always are, talking about transgender issues. So bring your questions and make sure you come to our show. Again, 5 p.m. on Thursday, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us for Out in Front tonight. And please stay safe and healthy. Thanks again, everyone. See you next week.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Tonight's episode of Out in Front is brought to you by our season sponsors, Concili Inc., Nevada State Education Association, One APIA Nevada, Silver State Voices, and and
Stefan and Marta Schmidt.
as well as our episode sponsors, Save Lives Nevada and Washoe Education Association.